Fellas, in the UFC, there are some fighters that are always in bangers, always in super interesting fights, and with that, we also end up getting fighters that are kind of always in boring fights, snooze fests. Nobody's excited to watch them fight. So I've got a list from S tier to D tier, S tier being essentially they are the most boring fighters in the UFC, and then D tier being, you know, they might be classed as uninteresting, but I won't call them boring. They can have good performances. So I've got a tier list of the most boring fighters in the UFC. Let me know if I've missed anyone out, because I'm sure there's a lot more boring fighters than the ones I've included. But starting off with the first fighter, we got Aljamain Sterling, just fought at UFC 300, and it was the worst fight on the card. It was in my opinion, the worst fight on the card. It wasn't really interesting. Maybe that was Cater's fault, but Aljamain Sterling, I'm going to put him E tier. The thing is, with Aljamain Sterling, you know what you're going to get. You know it's not going to be a fun fight. You know it's not going to be a banger, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a snooze fest. There are some times where he's able to get finishes like he did against Corey Sandhagen and TJ Dillashaw, and he's had a few, decent moments in fights, especially the one where he got knocked out cold, but for the majority of the time, it's just Sterling kind of trying to get people's back. And it's just not the most interesting fight to watch. Like we just said, the fight with Calvin Kattar wasn't that interesting. It was the worst on the card. The rematch with Peter Yan wasn't that good. The Cejudo fight, it was alright. I mean, it was two grapplers going at it, so it was kind of interesting, but I wouldn't class that as an interesting fight either. So Aljamain Sterling overall, he's just not that interesting to watch. You know what you're going to get with him. You know it's not going to be a banger or a bloody war, but at the same time, I wouldn't say he's one of the most boring fighters in the UFC. So Aljamain Sterling, I'll put him in B tier. I'll watch him, I'll tune into his fights. I'm sure, he can get a few moments every now and then. I mean, he did get a moment against Calvin Kattar by slamming him, but for the majority of the time, I wouldn't class Sterling as an interesting fighter. So I'll put him in B tier, in the middle, not extremely boring, but at the same time, I wouldn't say he's, interesting to watch. Then we've got Movsar Evloev, again, recently fought at UFC 297. I'm going to put Movsar Evloev in S tier. I actually think he's one of the most boring fighters in the UFC. I mean, obviously, the elephant in the room is the guy has never finished anyone in his entire UFC career. Every single one of his fights are decisions. People like to mock Belal Muhammad for having decisions, but then they look at Movsar Evloev. He has never finished anyone ever. I mean, at least Belal Muhammad was able to finish Sean Brady, like this guy. Yeah, out of all the featherweight divisions, the fact that he's in such a stacked division has something to do with it, but he's just not that interesting to watch. I mean, even when he's fighting interesting fighters who are always there to put on bangers like Arnold Allen or even Diego Lopez, it's still not the most interesting of fights. For the majority of the time, it's Evloev surviving on the feet, going for the head kick, which he barely ever lands, and then at the end of the fight, it's just him trying to take people's back, him trying to take people down, him trying to spam takedowns, and overall, I just have no interest in watching Evloev fight. I think he's about 1 or 2 fights away from a title shot, or maybe if we put him against a grappler like Sterling in this list, or, I don't know, Brian Ortega, or another grappler in the featherweight division, it could be fun. But for the majority of the time, I've never been interested watching Movsar Evloev fight. So yeah, I'm going to have to put him in S tier. A boring fighter, and I hope he doesn't become a champion. Then we've got Merab. A lot of people like to call Merab boring. You know what? I'm going to put Merab in D tier. I think people really overestimate how boring Merab is. I actually really enjoy watching him fight. The recent fight with Henry Cejudo was fun to watch. He was slamming Cejudo, he was ragdolling him, and there was a point where he caught him on the feet as well. Merab versus Cejudo was a fun fight to watch. Just because it involved grappling doesn't mean it's a bad fight. I actually thoroughly enjoyed that fight. Even his fight with Peter Yan, watching him dominate Peter Yan for 5 rounds. I mean, if you're a Peter Yan fan, obviously that's not going to be fun to watch. But the way that he did it so effortlessly to the former bantamweight champion, I was interested in watching that fight too. Fair enough, the Jose Aldo fight was quite boring, but overall, Merab, for the majority of the time, he's having fun fights. Just because they involve grappling doesn't mean it's boring. The slam that he got over Henry Cejudo, the fact that he was so effortlessly, just picking him up and slamming him and out-grappling him, and because he's such a good grappler and he's able to out-grapple everyone, I think he's an interesting fighter. I'm not going to say he's, one of the funnest fighters in the UFC, but I don't think he really belongs in this list with the other guys, so I'm going to put him in D tier. Quite an interesting guy to watch, and yeah, I'm going to tune into Merab's next fight. But talking of Belal Muhammad, yeah, not really too interested in watching this guy fight next. For Belal Muhammad, he's just got to go in S tier, hasn't he? I mean, at least he got a finish over Sean Brady, so he hasn't, the whole curse of not being able to finish has gone away, but it doesn't matter what type of fight he's having, whether he's a grappling heavy approach like he did recently against Vicente Luque, or it's on the feet like he did in his last fight against Gilbert Burns. He's just not an interesting fighter, no matter where the fight is. If it's on the feet, it's just point fighting. When it's grappling, it's just laying on people. And I don't want to be one of these people that kind of just, tune in every now and then to what's popular in the MMA community. People are hating on Belal Muhammad, let me join in. I just don't enjoy watching him fight. And even though he deserves the title shot next, and I do think he should get it next because he does deserve it, it's going to be one of the most boring title fights, in my opinion, in UFC history. Two fighters that aren't necessarily interesting. But yeah, Belal Muhammad overall, he's got a very just, wrestle, but it's not even like interesting wrestling. It's just laying on people, trying to rack up points. And Belal Muhammad, whether it's on the feet or when it comes to grappling, he's just not that interesting. He's a good fighter, which is why he's fighting for a belt next, but he is one of the most boring fighters in the UFC, and that's kind of what he's known for. You bring up the name Belal Muhammad, people just think of boring and people mocking him, so I'm going to have to put him in S tier. Then we've got Jailton Almeida, another really boring fighter. Now, I'm not going to put him in S tier because he has been able to rack up a lot of finishes. His last fight was quite interesting when he got finished, but before that it wasn't. Yeah, Jailton Almeida, he's just, again, a heavy grappler in the heavyweight division, but he's not a fun grappler like Tom Aspinall or a John Jones. He kind of just likes to take people down, have a submission attempt every now and then, and for the rest of the fight, it's just him with really light to moderate ground and pound, laying on people. And Jailton Almeida is just not that interesting. The fight with Derek Lewis was arguably the most the most boring fight of that year. His recent fight against Curtis Blades, that first round, it was kind of fun seeing him effortlessly take down Curtis Blades, but for the rest of the fight, the rest of the fight was him getting knocked out. The fight with Rosenstrike was alright until he got the finish, but even then it wasn't the most interesting fight until he eventually got the finish. So for Jailton Almeida, I'm putting him in S tier. I don't really enjoy watching this guy fight. He's got a fight booked with Alexander Romanov, which I think could be fun because Romanov's another heavy grappler. So I think if you match him up against other grapplers who can cancel out the grappling, it can be fun. But whenever we see Jailton Almeida against a striker, it's most likely going to be a boring fight, so I'll put him in A tier. Definitely one of the most boring in the UFC, but not, the king of boring in my opinion. Then we've got Ian Garry. I'm going to put Ian Garry in C tier. Listen, he's not the most interesting fighter. The fight with Jeff Neal wasn't the most interesting fight to watch, but I think people kind of not overestimate, but overhate him when it comes to actual fighting ability, obviously personality aside. When it comes to fighting, I feel like people overhate him. The fight with Neil Magny, the fact that he wasn't able to get a finish was quite poor from him, but at least he absolutely battered Neil Magny. And then the fight with Daniel Rodriguez, he got a finish. And he's just one of those fighters that you know what you're going to get. You know you're going to get a point-heavy style, and every now and then if he's fighting a bum, he might be able to get a decision win. A finish. But overall, Ian Garry, it's not like it's going to be a snooze fest every time he fights. It could end up in a finish, but for the majority of the time, he's way too technical. He's way too afraid of taking risks, and he's just a very similar point fighting style that him and Adesanya both have. So for Ian Garry, I'll put him in C tier. I can't say I look forward to watching him fight, but maybe the fact that he brings a lot of hype towards his fights, and maybe he's going to be fighting Colby Covington next, maybe that's going to be interesting. And talking of Colby Covington, yeah, he's also on this list, and he's in the exact same tier as Ian Garry, which doesn't make for a banger of a fight. Colby Covington, if you'd have asked me this like 3 years ago, I probably wouldn't have even included him in this list. The fight with Usman, both of the fights with Usman were actually interesting, and he's had a lot of bangers during his time, especially on his run to the first Usman fight. He was taking out contender after contender, absolutely just mauling them with his grappling, overwhelming people. But his last few fights has been so boring. The fight with Leon Edwards, I'm not going to act like Leon is one of the most interesting in the UFC either, but Colby just didn't show up. It was him walking across the cage, shot for a few takedowns, got a takedown every now and then and did absolutely nothing with it. The fight with Masvidal, apart from them taunting each other in the cage and Colby getting dropped, again, it was just him taking Masvidal down, trying to get his back and not really doing anything when he had the position. And then, yeah, just overall, Colby Covington, I just have no interest in watching him fight. I think him versus Ian Garry, people, even though it's a good fight on paper and I can't wait for the press conference, when you actually break down the styles of each other, I don't think it's going to be a banger. I think it's going to be Ian Garry being extremely cautious, trying to keep Covington away, and Covington doing the same thing he did against Leon Edwards, shooting for a takedown every now and then, probably not going to get it, and probably going to lose the fight. So Covington, I'm putting him in C tier. Not extremely boring, but at the same time, he's kind of fallen off these past few years. Then we've got Israel Adesanya. I'm also going to put Adesanya in C tier. I think with Adesanya, it really depends on whether he's defending a belt or fighting for the belt. Time and time again, whenever Adesanya is fighting for the belt, he's such a fun fighter. We've seen it in countless times, the fight with Whittaker, the fight with, the recent fight against Alex Pereira at UFC 287, and even some of his defenses, like I said, the one with Whittaker. But overall, Israel Adesanya, it is just a very point-heavy style. He doesn't like taking risks. It's kind of just leg kick, back off, leg kick, jab, leg kick, back off, look for a hook, miss. It's just not the most interesting style to watch. A shit ton of leg kicks. Doesn't really like engaging. Doesn't really like taking risks unless he's fighting for the belt. Barely been in any wars. The Gastelum one, again, that was ages ago. How many fights has he had since then that was snooze fest? The fight with Marvin Vettori was boring. The fight with Jared Cannonier was boring. Even the fight with Sean Strickland, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I think people heavily overestimate how fun that fight was. Israel Adesanya, C tier, great fighter, great striker, but the fact that he's so unwilling to take risks, I'm going to have to stick him in C tier. And then we've got Magomed Ankalaev. Magomed Ankalaev, for me, I'm also going to put him in D tier. I feel like with Ankalaev, people just think he's boring because he's Dagestani. People see the fact that he's a Dagestani contender and he's got decent wrestling and he's boring. But when you actually break down Ankalaev, I'd say he's more of a striker than a grappler. There's been a few times in a couple of fights where he's gone for the takedown and, tried out grappling people, which rightfully so, he's one of the best grapplers, if not the best grappler right now in the light heavyweight division. But a majority of the fights, he's on his feet and he's finishing people. The fight with Jan Blachowicz was back and forth. His recent knockout over Johnny Walker was really interesting. The fights with Ian Cutelaba as well. Ankalaev, I think him versus Pereira is going to be an absolute banger. What I like about him is he's a dangerous striker. He's not a point fighter. He likes taking risks and he's a dangerous striker, but he's also got the grappling to keep his opponents guessing and also is like a secondary option. Overall, Magomed Ankalaev, I actually enjoy watching him fight. And yeah, I can't wait to see him versus Pereira. I think that's a really tough matchup for both of them. But overall, Ankalaev, I can't lie, and I actually quite enjoy watching him fight. I think he's dangerous and he's got so many ways to win. So similar to Merab, I'm putting him in D tier. Then we've got a guy we've been speaking on in this video quite a lot, Leon Edwards, and I'm going to put him in B tier. Yeah, Leon Edwards, I mean, the viral clip has gone around recently of Donald Cerrone pointing in the middle of the canvas, similar to how Holloway and Gaethje did, and Leon Edwards just backing off, which kind of just shows what fighter Leon Edwards is. His style works. I'm not going to sit here and act like his style doesn't work. I'd say he's more interesting, even though he's on the same tier, I'd say he's more interesting than Sterling as well, but yeah, again, it's just a very point-style heavy, approach to fights. The fight with Usman the second time, I know that was the majority of Usman taking him down, but until the head kick, it wasn't the most interesting fight. The trilogy of Usman, that was actually quite an interesting fight. I like the technicality of that fight. The fight with Colby Covington, snooze fest. The fight with Belal Muhammad is probably going to be one of the worst fights you can possibly make in the UFC. At least one of the worst title fights you can make. That's going to be absolutely boring. His fights leading up to the title shot, obviously we've seen him against Belal Muhammad before. It was kind of just a back and forth on the feet, but not a banger or anything like that. Overall, Leon Edwards, you know what you're going to get. He doesn't really tend to go for finishes often. I won't class him as a finisher. He's more of a point style type of guy. Doesn't really like taking risks at all. Very similar to Israel Adesanya. I'll put him in B tier. He's very, very technical, which can be interesting to watch. He's not just leg kick and walk away like Adesanya is. He's very technical, but at the same time, the fact that he hasn't really been involved in many bangers, I'm going to have to put him in B tier. Technical, and it works, and he's well-rounded, but interesting-wise, I'm not going to sit here and act like he's interesting. Then we've got another guy from the UK. We've got Lerone Murphy going to be taking on Edson Barboza this year. For Lerone Murphy, I'm going to put him on the same tier as Leon Edwards. Yeah, he's one of the few British fighters that can actually grapple. He's got great grappling, but I wish he did a lot more ground and pound. We saw in his last fight against Josh at UFC, I think it was the Marcin Tibura versus Aspinall card. It was one in the UK, I don't know which one it was. But Lerone Murphy, yeah, he's got a very heavy wrestling approach to things. He's undefeated, so it works. But on the feet, he's just, again, he doesn't really offer much on the feet. He kind of just survives on the feet, goes for the takedown, gets the takedown, gets control time. Barely ever latches on submissions, barely any does significant damage with ground and pound, and overall, Lerone Murphy, you put it on a UFC London card where there's a bunch of bangers, he's going to be sticking out like a sore thumb because of how uninteresting it is. So Lerone Murphy, B tier. Hopefully him versus Edson Barboza can be a banger, but the style of Lerone Murphy overall just ain't that interesting. Then we've got Sean Strickland. A few of you are going to be going wild, why is Sean Strickland on this list? But I feel like the star power and the press conferences and the overall personality of Sean Strickland makes people think that he's a lot more interested in the octagon than he is. I think Sean Strickland's style, again, it's just not that interesting to watch. I'm going to put him in C tier. I don't think he's a boring fighter. I would not call Sean Strickland a boring fighter. He had a decent little scrap with Dricus du Plessis at UFC 297. But even the fight with Adesanya, right? I know it was a big upset because he was able to get one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. He dropped Adesanya. But the overall fight from round 1 to round 5, again, it wasn't a banger. There wasn't much memorable moments besides round 5 and round 1 when he dropped him. It was kind of just, again, another point-heavy style from Adesanya and Strickland just outboxing him. You know what you're going to get with Sean Strickland. You know he's going to be walking forward, trying to outbox you. Most of the time it works, but it's not, an absolute banger of a style. He's not the type of fighter you expect to be put in a bloodbath. So Sean Strickland, I'll put him in C tier. Not a boring fighter, but at the same time, I feel like people very heavily overestimate how funny he is because of his personality, when in reality, his style, he's just walk forward, have sharp defense, and land a jab, get the parry up, and yeah, that's Sean Strickland style, C tier. And then finally, we've got Gamrot. Going to be fighting probably in a #1 contender fight against Charles Oliveira soon, and I would put Gamrot in A tier. Another really boring fighter. I feel like with Gamrot, it's only interesting when it's him getting battered like it was against Beneil Dariush. But yeah, he had the recent fight against Rafael dos Anjos. It was a really boring fight on the prelims of UFC 299. He had the fight with Rafael Fiziev. Again, it wasn't that interesting, and then Rafael Fiziev ended up getting injured. The fight with Arman Tsarukyan was all right. Overall, Gamrot, he's a very boring wrestler. He doesn't really take risks. He's not a great striker. He just survives on the feet. He's not able to get submissions a lot either. He's not really a submission grappler. He kind of just takes people down. Early on in his career, he might have been a submission grappler, but now he's at the top level. You don't really see Gamrot going and getting submissions that often, so he's an extremely lucky fighter the way that his past few fights have played out, and I'm going to put him in A tier. One of the most boring fighters in the UFC, in my opinion, and I really hope that he doesn't beat Charles Oliveira, but that is my list of the most boring fighters in the UFC. Let me know your thoughts on this list, and if I've missed any fighters out, because there's definitely a few boring fighters in the UFC, and thank you for watching.